Tonight you're heading into the dark, splintery corners of a medieval peasant's cottage, the kind with a roof that leaks, a floor made of questionable hay, and yes, chickens clucking around your ankles like feathery goblins, because before modern beds, blackout curtains, or the concept of privacy, sleep looked very different. In this absurdly cosy story, you'll explore the bizarre bedtime rituals of peasants in the Dark Ages, from curling up beside livestock to fending off demonic flatulence and unexplained bite marks. You're about to discover why medieval sleep wasn't just hard to come by, it was about survival. If you're enjoying these strange and sleepy walks through history, feel free to like, subscribe, and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now tuck yourself in and try not to think about what's nesting beneath the straw. In the flickering dark of a medieval cottage, warmth came at a price, and that price was paltry. During the colder months, peasants often brought their animals indoors at night, not for sentimental reasons, but for sheer survival. A chicken, with its fluffy exterior and impressive 106-degree internal body temperature, became less of a farm animal and more of a feathery space heater, and that was the good news. The bad news was that these chickens, along with goats, pigs, and the occasional sheep, all shared the same living space, often the same floor, sometimes the same bed, and always the same air, thick, musty, and tinged with whatever had died underneath the straw 3 weeks earlier. This wasn't a quirky exception. In fact, for the average medieval European peasant, keeping livestock inside was normal. Cottages were usually one-room structures with dirt floors and poor ventilation. Heat was difficult to retain, and windows, if they existed at all, were stuffed with oily cloth or thin wood. So animals weren't just guests, they were insulation. But co-sleeping with livestock came with some unfortunate side effects. Mattresses, when available, were typically stuffed with straw, hay, or even leaves. Over time, these would compress into a crunchy, mouldy slab that smelled of mildew and regret. They were rarely cleaned, almost never replaced, and often doubled as breeding grounds for lice, mites, and fleas. If something itched in the night, the culprit could be anything from a flea to a splinter to the beginning of scurvy. Even the concept of a bed was up for debate. Many peasants slept directly on the floor, sometimes on a thin pallet, other times simply on rushes scattered like an itchy, inconsistent welcome mat. And when it came to warmth, the best option wasn't a wool blanket, it was body heat, from your spouse, your children, your livestock, and perhaps a particularly bold goose. Privacy didn't exist. Multiple generations might sleep side by side wrapped in scratchy linen, while chickens roosted in the rafters and pigs rooted underfoot. Roosters crowed at all hours, not just at dawn, and it wasn't uncommon to wake up with feathers in your mouth, or worse, a droppings-related surprise in your sock. What sounds like a sleep-deprived hallucination was, for many, simply Tuesday. Historically, this cosy chaos was part of a broader cultural norm. Life was communal, space was limited, and the idea of separate bedrooms, or even separate beds, was a luxury reserved for the upper classes. Sleep itself was fragmented. Many peasants followed the pattern of segmented sleep, where the night was broken into two distinct phases. One would go to sleep shortly after dusk, awaken for a few hours around midnight to tend fires, pray, or check on animals, and then drift back into a second sleep cycle closer to dawn. In these quiet midnight hours, with the fire low and the room heavy with breath and feathers, people often experience strange dreams, hallucinations, or episodes of sleep paralysis. Naturally, this was blamed on witches. When one wakes up unable to move, pinned beneath the suffocating weight of a wool blanket, a half-rotten pig, and the spiritual pressure of poor life choices, it's easy to imagine a demon sitting on your chest. In medieval Europe, this phenomenon was often described in religious terms: an incubus, a hag, a punishment for sins. But realistically, it may have just been the result of poor sleep hygiene and excessive exposure to barnyard gases. Because sleeping with chickens didn't just bring warmth, it brought noise, disease, allergens, and more droppings than any mattress should reasonably endure. And yet, oddly, this strange setup was a form of comfort. The noises of animals, the crackling of firewood, the rustling of sleeping bodies, they reminded people that they weren't alone. Survival was collective. Misery was shared. And if everyone was cold, at least they were cold together. Chickens weren't pets, but they were companions of necessity. Feathered furnace units in a time when central heating didn't exist, and blankets were worth their weight in wool. So when you imagine the peasant curled up by the fire, eyes closed, wrapped in rags, and dreaming of a better life, remember, there is a very good chance a chicken is tucked under their arm, possibly snoring, possibly plotting. And if all of that sounds strange, just wait until the lights go out and the mattress itself comes to life. Because up next, we're exploring what lived inside the bedding. Spoiler, it bites. Now close your eyes, try not to scratch, and welcome to the peasant's night shift. And of course, when the chickens finally stopped flapping and the cottage settled into a low murmur of breath and snore and bubbling digestive regret, that's when the mattress came alive. Not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. Because medieval bedding was, without exaggeration, one of the most consistently disgusting and biologically active objects in the average peasant household. While the modern mind may associate a mattress with comfort and support, the average medieval peasant would have associated it with skin disease and something crawling into your ear while you slept, and not gently. Bedding, if it existed at all, was typically handmade from whatever organic material could be gathered in bulk. Straw was common, though not the golden, sun-dried kind you might imagine. It was usually damp, already broken down from prior use, and darkened with mould or the remnants of last season's animal feed. Some mattresses were stuffed with dried leaves, reeds, or even seaweed if you lived near a coast and hated yourself. These materials were crammed into a sack made of rough linen or hemp, and stitched shut until the seams bulged like a tick. Now, medieval peasants didn't rotate or clean these mattresses. Why would they? The idea of laundering bedding was as foreign as owning a second pair of shoes. These sacks sat on the bed frame or floor for years, slowly absorbing body oils, sweat, animal dander, spilled food, drool, and occasional moments of panic during plague seasons. By the end of a single winter, a well-used mattress had become a dense fungal marsh of everything wrong with the human epidermis, and that's when the real occupants moved in. Fleas were guaranteed, so were lice. But the true horror lay in the bedbugs. Cymex lectularius, as they're known to entomologists and night terrors alike, have been found in archaeological bedding dating back to the Stone Age. In medieval Europe, they thrived. These flat, reddish parasites were masters of stealth, nesting deep within the folds of straw mattresses and emerging only at night to gorge on human blood. One source from the 15th century described them as night devils, which is a surprisingly accurate scientific description, given how little anyone understood about insects back then. Once infested, a mattress would become a silent battleground. Bedbugs could survive for months without feeding, and were nearly impossible to eliminate without completely destroying the bed itself. But peasants didn't have the luxury of destruction. Most simply accepted that their mattress was now a shared space. To be fair, there were efforts to fight back. Herbs like lavender, tansy, and wormwood were stuffed between the layers of straw in the hopes of repelling the tiny invaders. Some peasants even burned feathers or sprinkled ashes into the bedding to discourage bugs, which is a bit like throwing confetti at a tornado. Occasionally, a particularly cursed mattress would begin to rot from the inside, not metaphorically. The mixture of dampness, mildew, sweat, and decomposing organic filler created a sort of mattress compost system, where the line between bed and garden became dangerously thin. This could attract even more unwelcome guests like beetles, centipedes, or if you were very unlucky, rodents. Imagine curling up for the night, already itchy from 1,000 bites, only to hear something chewing its way out from underneath your shoulder blade. And people say insomnia is a modern invention. It was also common for peasants to simply share bedding with their livestock, especially during winter months. which meant the mattress became a communal pit of germs and parasites that traded hosts like a medieval flea market. If one person in the household had scabies, soon everyone did. If one animal had mange, the entire sleeping area might begin to smell like decaying wool. Parasites didn't just affect sleep. They could trigger open sores, infections, and long-term skin diseases. But the itch wasn't always taken seriously. In some cases, chronic scratching was chalked up to bad humours or punishment from divine forces, rather than the obvious swarm of insects living 3 inches from your face. And yet, people kept sleeping on them. Not because they were lazy or unaware, but because there were no alternatives. You couldn't just walk to the mattress store and buy something with memory foam and a 10-year warranty. The best a peasant could do was shake out the straw every few months and pretend the writhing beneath the surface wasn't real. By morning, most people woke up with red welts across their arms and legs, the result of a long night of involuntary blood donation. Children were particularly susceptible, often appearing with swollen eyes or patches of raw skin from relentless scratching. And there was no ointment, no antihistamines, just a resigned shrug and maybe a dab of pig lard if things looked especially angry. Sometimes in desperation people would burn the entire bedding stack and start over, but that was expensive. Straw cost money, and so did cloth. More often, they just let the mattress age into its final stage, a flat, greasy mat that was less a bed than a warning to future generations. And still, they slept. Because exhaustion wins. Because lice are quieter than hunger. Because bedbugs don't kill you. They just keep you company. Eventually the fire in the hearth would die out, the last embers whispering upward through a smoke-blackened chimney, and silence would fall across the room. In that darkness, under that buzzing, crawling, whispering sack of organic decay, sleep would come. Not peace, not comfort, just sleep. Of course, the mattress wasn't the only thing threatening your well-being after sundown. There were other hazards, unspoken ones, things creeping in the corners, sounds that didn't belong, questions about what might be buried just beneath the floorboards and why the dog refused to sleep indoors. Because after the mattress stops moving, it's time to worry about what else is inside the walls, and whether or not it wants to be seen. Eventually the mattress would stop twitching. The lice would settle in for their final feeding. The last scratching sounds from inside the straw would fade into the rhythmic breathing of the room. And just when everything seemed safe enough to relax into some form of consciousness-adjacent rest, that's when the real trouble began. Because in the medieval world, silence was rarely comforting. It was suspicious. Nighttime in a medieval peasant cottage was not peaceful. It was a sensory gauntlet of groans, creaks, howls, mutters and whispers, most of which had no convenient explanation. The walls themselves seemed to sigh. Rafters cracked with temperature shifts. Roof thatch rustled with the movements of something that was either a mouse or a very small man with sinister intentions. And if the chickens stirred in their sleep, the flapping alone could trigger a full-body jolt that felt like a divine warning. Peasants in the Middle Ages lived in a world soaked with superstition. Every noise at night carried meaning. Every creak of a board could be the footstep of something unholy. It was widely believed that demons, spirits, and restless souls wandered after sundown, particularly around thresholds, corners, and anywhere too quiet for comfort. This belief wasn't a fringe idea. It was cultural bedrock. Monasteries recorded sightings. Priests delivered sermons about it. Entire communities agreed that the darkness held more than just cold air. It was also common to believe that witches travelled in spirit form at night, slipping through cracks in the door, hiding in chimneys, or riding household animals into nearby fields to dance around bonfires and curse livestock. Cats were especially suspicious. A cat staring into an empty corner of a room was never just a cat. It was a messenger, possibly an accomplice, definitely not to be trusted. People responded with rituals. Charcoal crosses were drawn on doors and hearthstones. Iron objects were hung over windows to ward off fey spirits. Some slept with knives under their pillows, not for burglars but for the unexplainable entities that reportedly fed on dreams or caused sudden illness. Garlic, salt, and even stale bread were placed strategically around the home to confuse or trap evil forces. And if none of that worked, you simply accepted the fact that tonight was not your night. Sleep was already fragile. Most people only had a few hours of uninterrupted rest before the cold woke them up, or the livestock began shifting again. But layered on top of that natural discomfort was the ever-present anxiety that something unnatural might be watching. Medieval manuscripts include stories of night hags, phantom dogs, floating women without faces, and spirits that entered the home by mimicking the voice of a recently deceased relative. In a world with no streetlights, no night patrols, and no such thing as therapy, fear didn't need evidence. It just needed darkness. Even the church fueled this atmosphere. Nighttime prayer rituals included passages about protection from evil and temptation. Some monasteries prohibited certain types of singing after dusk to avoid accidentally summoning what they referred to as unwelcome listeners. And while most peasants didn't read, they absorbed these fears through oral tradition and local gossip. Every village had a story, every family had a warning, and every house had a shadow that no one liked to mention by name. It didn't help that many peasants were malnourished, dehydrated, or suffering from chronic illness. Hallucinations were more common than most would expect. Extreme fatigue, fever, or untreated infections could easily cause a person to hear voices or see strange movements in the dark. These weren't interpreted as medical symptoms. They were signs, omens, sometimes punishments, occasionally prophecies, and always terrifying. Of course, much of the danger was real. Bandits did exist. So did wolves. So did neighbours who held grudges and knew which windows didn't latch properly. Peasants had to rely on thin wooden shutters, crude door bars, and the collective noise of a sleeping family to deter intruders. If you lived alone, you were vulnerable. If you lived near the forest, you were doomed. Families slept in clusters, not just for warmth, but for protection. The more bodies in a room, the more noise, the more witnesses, the more deterrence. Children were sometimes placed near the centre, buffered by adults and livestock. The family dog, if it wasn't already asleep on someone's face, served as both alarm system and possible sacrifice in the event of a sudden break-in. That may sound cruel, but in the middle of the night, survival logic always wins. There were also the fires. A hearth was rarely allowed to go fully out. It wasn't just about warmth. Fire kept things away, both literal and figurative things. The act of stoking embers, whispering prayers into the smoke, and arranging burnt logs in specific patterns had spiritual meaning. Some peasants believed that letting a fire die completely before dawn could open a doorway to the other side, which, to be clear, no one wanted. Even dreams were viewed with suspicion. Good dreams were considered divine gifts. Bad dreams were warnings. Repeated dreams meant someone was trying to tell you something. If you dreamed of teeth falling out, it meant death. If you dreamed of drowning, it meant debt. And if you dreamed of flying, it meant your soul was leaving your body too soon, and you should wake up immediately and eat something salted. Sometimes the only real comfort at night came from the sounds of others. The snores of a parent, the quiet grumble of a sleeping pig, the restless coo of a hen settling her feathers. These noises, as absurd and unpleasant as they might seem, reminded you that you were not alone, that whatever was out there would have to deal with all of you, not just you. But that didn't stop the whispers, or the sudden clatter of a pot that should not have moved, or the icy sensation on your neck when the wind wasn't blowing, or the dog's ears perking up while everyone else slept. Because in the medieval world, the line between real and imagined threats didn't matter. What mattered was whether or not you made it to morning. And speaking of mornings, the only thing worse than the night itself was what came immediately after. Because once the sun rose and the spirit supposedly vanished, you were left with the aftermath, the evidence, the footprints in the ash, the egg laid in the wrong corner, the child who claimed to see someone hovering by the door, the chicken who suddenly refused to face north. Which is why so many peasants turned to protection rituals. Simple gestures performed before bed that supposedly kept the night at bay. A pinch of salt tossed into the hearth. A whispered phrase repeated 3 times. a rock placed at the foot of the bed to confuse the spirits about where your head was located, and sometimes it worked, or at least it gave the illusion of control. Of course, protection only got you so far, because even if the spirits left you alone and the mattress didn't bite and the chickens didn't scream and the wind didn't sound like Latin chanting, there was still the problem of the chamber pot. Once the whispers faded and the rooster gave its first misguided crow around 2 hours too early, the final ordeal of the night arrived. The chamber pot, that humble, grungy container lurking beneath the bed or beside the hearth, waiting patiently to destroy whatever fragile piece had managed to settle in the room. There was no graceful way to use it, no elegant process, no quiet dignity. It was a necessary evil, a porcelain or wooden declaration of everything civilization had not yet figured out. For the average medieval peasant, the concept of walking outdoors to relieve oneself in the middle of the night was not just unpleasant, it was dangerous. Mud paths were slippery, wells and ditches were invisible in the dark. There were animals to consider, sometimes wolves, sometimes other people, and of course, there were the spirits. The medieval imagination had no shortage of entities lurking just beyond the cottage threshold, many of which were believed to linger near latrines specifically to torment those foolish enough to squat alone in the moonlight. So the chamber pot became a nightly ritual. Often kept under the bed or behind a thin curtain if the home had one, it was used quickly and in hushed resignation. The pots themselves were made of whatever material was affordable. Earthenware was common, though wooden buckets and repurposed cooking pots were also used, creating the troubling overlap between dinnerware and disaster. And it was rarely just for one person. Entire families shared the same chamber pot overnight. Parents, children, guests, even the occasional visiting priest all contributed to the bubbling community broth by morning. There were no flushing mechanisms, no liners, no scented tablets, just the slow accumulation of waste in a room already packed with breath, sweat, feathers, and unresolved childhood trauma. In wealthier homes, chamber pots were sometimes ornately decorated or given lids, but for peasants, aesthetics took a firm back seat to not spilling, and spills were common. The average sleeping arrangement involved multiple people shuffling around in the dark, occasionally stepping directly into the pot or knocking it over completely. When that happened, there was no towel, just straw, lots and lots of straw. Emptying the pot was often the first task of the day. It had to be done before breakfast or any form of spiritual reflection. Some dumped the contents into backyard pits, others into communal ditches, and many straight into the streets. Urban areas were particularly vulnerable. Alleyways in cities like London or Paris were notoriously foul by morning, with waste splashed across cobblestones like a medieval Jackson Pollock painting made entirely of regrets. In rural villages, peasants sometimes maintained a designated dung heap at the edge of their property. These piles were not just convenient, they were strategic. Human waste, along with manure from livestock, was used as fertilizer, creating an endless and somewhat grotesque cycle of production and consumption. The same hands that emptied the pot would often be the ones sowing seeds the next morning. There was no soap, just a quick rinse in the nearest bucket and a shrug that said hygiene was for the wealthy. The stench was relentless. Cottage interiors rarely had ventilation beyond a hole in the roof or a cracked shutter. If the pot was particularly ripe or had been used heavily overnight, the morning air took on the quality of steamed failure. It clung to the walls, seeped into clothing, and occasionally made people faint, and that was considered normal. To reduce the smell, some peasants sprinkled ashes or herbs into the pot after each use. Rosemary, thyme, and mugwort were common, though their actual effectiveness was debatable. In colder months, some households tried to freeze the contents by keeping the pot near the door, which worked until someone stepped in it barefoot on their way out to tend the animals. Children were often responsible for transporting the pot to the waste pile, a task sometimes known as the morning carry. It was considered a form of training, a reminder that life was unpleasant and that personal dignity was optional. Dropping the pot was one of the worst offences in a peasant household, especially if it occurred indoors. Shaming rituals varied. Sometimes it was a scolding, Sometimes it involved being made to clean it by hand using only straw and rainwater. And sometimes it was just a long, silent breakfast. In towns with larger populations, public latrines existed, but they were rarely used at night. These facilities were communal, poorly maintained, and frequently the site of crime or supernatural folklore. Stories circulated about demons lurking beneath the benches or cursed spirits who dragged victims down through the cesspit if they tarried too long. Whether or not these tales were true was irrelevant. The fear was real. There were also seasonal issues. In winter, chamber pots froze solid, turning the morning routine into a strange game of chisel and pour. In summer, the heat amplified the aroma, attracting flies and turning sleeping quarters into buzzing, foul-tinted ecosystems of microbial ambition. Nothing says good morning like a swarm of insects escaping the rim of a container that doubled as last night's bathroom and tomorrow's fertilizer. Despite all of this, chamber pots were not considered disgraceful. They were practical, universal. Some people even decorated them with religious symbols, believing it might discourage demons from tampering with the contents. Others carved initials into the side, marking territory in a home where privacy was already a myth. It was not uncommon to hear arguments about whose turn it was to clean or carry, especially in homes with limited space or extended family members who overstayed their welcome. And then there were the animals. Chickens occasionally tried to roost on the rim. Dogs licked the side if left unattended. Pigs were known to knock them over while searching for food. One particularly disturbing folk tale tells of a cat that drowned in a chamber pot and returned to haunt the household every time someone tried to go to the bathroom in peace. It is unclear whether this story is true. What is clear is that chamber pots were central to the nightly rhythm of peasant life. A grim little anchor of bodily function in a world that had no plumbing, no privacy, and no patience for squeamishness. And just when it seemed like you could not possibly endure another medieval bodily function, the rooster would scream again, and the children would wake up, and the entire cycle would begin anew. There was no reset button, no vacation from the pot, only the slow acceptance that sleep, waste, and survival all happened in the same place, sometimes within inches of each other. Which leads to the obvious next question. What happens when illness strikes in the middle of the night and the pot is not enough? When medieval digestion, already on a knife's edge, decides to turn against its host in spectacular fashion? When the chamber pot overflowed or proved insufficient for the bodily disaster in progress? The next stage of medieval night suffering involved the emergency bucket. Or in most cases, anything that vaguely resembled a vessel and was not currently holding food. Buckets, baskets, ceramic jugs, old boots and cupped hands all had their moment in the desperate dance of midnight illness. Because when your stomach turned against you in the 1300s, it did not ask for permission. Medieval digestion was already walking a tightrope. Most peasants lived on a steady diet of grain-based gruel, stale bread, boiled vegetables, and the occasional questionably cooked meat. The bread alone was often an assault on the system. Rye bread contaminated with ergot fungus caused hallucinations, vomiting, and full-body convulsions that sometimes ended in death. But ergot bread was also filling and available, so it remained a staple, especially in lean years. There was no concept of expiration dates or food safety. If the food looked vaguely edible and did not immediately sprout legs and walk away, it was dinner. Salted meats could be rancid, cheese might be green, vegetables could be covered in soil and half rotted. All of it was fair game. And so, late into the night, long after the fire had dimmed and the chickens had stopped muttering in their sleep, a peasant might wake up with a sudden jolt of nausea so violent it felt like divine punishment. There was no bathroom, no hallway to shuffle down, no fan to drown out the noises, just one room, full of people all pretending not to notice. Vomiting indoors was considered an unfortunate but necessary reality. There was no etiquette for it, no social script. You simply leaned over the nearest corner, vessel, or open window and hoped that whatever emerged did not return with friends. Some peasants kept a designated sick bowl near the bed. though it was often indistinguishable from the soup pot if someone forgot to rinse it in the morning. Linen scraps were used to mop up the worst of it, but these were rarely washed, just shaken out and reused until they disintegrated into a fine historical mist of bacteria and despair. The smell lingered. The warmth of the fire only amplified the aroma. Sick children were bundled tightly and placed near the door in case more came out, partly to protect the rest of the household, and partly so that if things got bad, they could be carried outside without much ceremony. Adults rarely had that luxury. The idea of a peasant vomiting discreetly was laughable. It was noisy, wet, and often accompanied by moaning, apologies, and pleas to whatever saint governed stomach health. Saint Erasmus, for the record, was the patron saint of abdominal pain. Whether or not he was listening was another matter. Food poisoning was not a recognised condition. Illness was attributed to bad humours, sin, cold air, or being cursed by the neighbour who made better porridge. If several people in a household got sick at once, it was often assumed that someone had let in a malevolent spirit by forgetting to bless the hearth before bed. There were no doctors, only folk remedies, and those remedies could be just as terrifying as the sickness itself. A popular treatment for nighttime nausea involved tying a toad to the foot of the bed. It was believed that the creature would absorb the illness during the night. Some households burned dried herbs like pennyroyal or angelica and waved the smoke toward the patient while chanting psalms in Latin that no one fully understood. Others placed a hot stone on the belly, not to heal, but to force a purge. One recorded remedy from the 14th century Germany involved drinking stale beer mixed with powdered eggshells and mustard. The patient often vomited again after this, but that was considered a sign of success. Of course, not all vomiting was caused by food. Parasites were rampant. Worms of various shapes and sizes lived quite happily inside the intestines of medieval peasants, especially children. When they made themselves known, it was usually at night and in spectacular fashion. Accounts exist of worms crawling out of the mouth or nose during episodes of sickness. These were not isolated events. They were part of daily life. Some communities held worm-charming rituals to try and banish the infestation through song or dance. Others simply learned to accept them as co-tenants in the digestive tract. Pregnant women often suffered the most. Morning sickness had no name or understanding in medieval Europe. Vomiting during pregnancy was considered either a punishment for sexual sin or a sign that the baby would grow up to be stubborn. Remedies included burying garlic under the threshold, wearing a necklace of dried frog intestines, or consuming powdered deer antler mixed with goat milk. If none of that worked, the woman was expected to endure it silently while still milking cows, grinding grain, and avoiding eye contact with chickens. And then there were the fevers. Night fevers could strike without warning. Typhoid, dysentery, and various unnamed plagues caused sweating, vomiting, and confusion that often led people to wander outdoors in the middle of the night and collapse in the mud. Neighbours found them at dawn, half naked and whispering about angels or strange lights. Some recovered, some did not. The sick were occasionally banished to barns or outbuildings if the rest of the family feared contamination. If no secondary shelter was available, a line of ash or chalk was drawn around the patient's sleeping space to trap the illness inside. The communal nature of peasant living made it nearly impossible to avoid cross-contamination. If one person vomited into the straw mattress, everyone slept on it anyway. If a child threw up in the bed, the only solution was to rotate the sleeping order until the wet patch dried out. There were no antiseptics, no gloves, no ventilation. Just the medieval strategy of pretending it smelled better than it did. By morning the sickness might pass, or it might spread. Meals would be cooked using the same utensils that had handled last night's disaster. Leftovers were rare, but when they existed, they were often left uncovered near the hearth, where flies laid eggs and mould took root. And so the cycle began again. Eat, sleep, vomit, repeat. And through it all the chickens watched, indifferent, judging, occasionally stepping into the aftermath with little regard for the sanctity of personal space, because in the world of the medieval peasant, every surface was both sleeping area and potential biohazard. Nothing was clean, everything was shared, and illness was not an exception. It was a roommate. Still, this was not the worst part of the night. That title belonged to the lice, because when the stomach calmed and the fever faded, and the bucket was emptied and the fire was stoked again, the itching would begin, and it would not stop. Once the bucket was scrubbed and the retching had stopped echoing off the thatch roof, there came a brief window of calm. The fire settled. The dog curled up. The air stopped swirling with whatever had just come out of someone's stomach. But peace was not guaranteed, because in that moment, as you began to drift into a half-sleep that almost resembled comfort, a soft tickle ran across your scalp, then another, and before long the medieval peasant night resumed its true ritual, scratching. Lice were not a problem. They were a population. They were part of the household. They did not arrive. They were always there. They lived in your hair, your clothing, your bedding, your undergarments if you had any, and occasionally inside the seams of your shoes. They came in varieties too. Head lice, body lice, pubic lice, all feasting, all breeding, all thriving in the warm folds of your peasant existence. Body lice were particularly aggressive. They lived not directly on the skin but inside the folds of clothing, and laid eggs in the seams. Most peasants wore the same garments for weeks at a time without washing, and those garments were typically made of wool or rough linen, which offered the perfect conditions for lice to hide, hatch and multiply in numbers that defied belief. One 15th century medical text described body lice infestations as clouds, not metaphors, literal clouds of insects emerging when a tunic was shaken out. Sleeping meant constant movement. You scratched your scalp until it bled, then your armpits, then the backs of your knees. There was no relief. Lice bites caused small red welts and an unbearable crawling sensation that could make even the most exhausted body stay alert. Children were hit hardest. Their skin was softer, their resistance lower, and their ability to not scream in the night limited. Parents grew used to the sound of slapping, scratching, and the occasional weeping when a particularly bold louse made its way into an ear canal. Treatment options were not promising. Some peasants rubbed ashes or pig lard into their hair in hopes of suffocating the lice. Others used vinegar or urine. One common folk remedy involved pressing a hot poker to the scalp not to burn the lice, but to convince them to relocate. Herbs like rue, lavender or pennyroyal were sometimes tucked into head coverings, though their effectiveness was more spiritual than scientific. The idea was that bad smells repelled bad creatures. Unfortunately, everything already smelled bad, including the lice. Fleas added to the chaos. They did not live on the body like lice, but preferred to nest in straw bedding, floor rushes, and the woolen cloaks draped over sleeping forms. Unlike lice, fleas could jump, spectacularly. They could launch themselves across the room, bite you on the ankle, and vanish before retaliation. Flea bites were smaller than louse bites, but delivered in clusters, often around the waistline or along the thighs. They caused intense itching, and worse, they were blamed for more than just discomfort. In the 14th century, fleas became infamous as vectors of the bubonic plague. Though peasants did not understand bacteria or transmission pathways, they noticed that fleas came with death. When the fleas arrived in greater numbers, people got sick. Families stopped sharing beds with visitors. Shoes were burned. Blankets were buried. It did not stop the spread. It only left the survivors cold. Then came the mites. Invisible to the naked eye, they lived in straw bedding and burrowed into the skin. Scabies mites caused intense, continuous itching that got worse at night. The burrows left behind small, inflamed lines, often mistaken for curses. Infestation could spread through shared clothing or even casual skin contact. And since no one had clean hands or separate linens, the chances of escaping scabies in a peasant home were statistically close to zero. Sleep was a war, not a metaphorical one. A literal skin-level battle between your body and 1,000 tiny invaders determined to eat, breed, and defecate in your personal crevices. The scratching was communal. Whole families itched together. Couples scratched each other's backs in synchronized misery. Children were picked over like fruit trees, and if the lice were particularly bad, some resorted to shaving their heads entirely. Baldness among peasants was rarely a fashion statement. It was pest control. But even then, the lice could return within days. Shaved heads offered limited relief if the bedding remained infested, and it always did. The straw mattress was rarely emptied. If it was, the new straw was often just a rearranged version of the old straw. You could switch beds, but you'd still be sleeping in the same ecosystem of biological ambition and mild fungal bloom. There were superstitions about lice. Some believed that having too many lice was a sign of sin, particularly gluttony or laziness. Others thought lice were placed on the earth to humble the poor. More optimistically, a few cultures believed that lice were a sign of vitality, that they preferred the living and avoided the dying. One 13th century monk even claimed that lice were proof of divine testing, a way for the soul to earn redemption through patience and restraint. No one knows if that monk ever tried to sleep with 30 lice crawling across his eyelid. It was not just humans. Livestock also carried lice, ticks and mites, many of which happily crossed over to the peasant population. Sleeping beside chickens meant chicken mites. Sleeping near pigs meant mange. Even dogs carried fleas, and they were often welcome companions in winter. The line between pet and parasite transmission device was blurry at best. And still, life continued. Peasants woke up each day with swollen bites, inflamed skin, and new colonies of insects beginning their morning routines. They washed rarely, but when they did, it was often with cold water and coarse rags. Soap was expensive, baths were rare. A good scratch against a rough wall beam was often more satisfying than anything resembling hygiene. Scratching in public was expected. Peasants scratched during meals, at church, while trading goods, even during funerals. It was not rude, it was life. A quick inspection of a neighbour's hair for lice was not an insult. It was a favour. Picking nits from a spouse's head was considered an act of affection. A proposal might come later, or a slap, depending on what you found. Eventually the body adapted. You stopped noticing the crawling. The itching became background noise. Sleep returned, not because the lice went away, but because your brain gave up. Exhaustion. Overpowered disgust. You learned to scratch in your sleep. You trained yourself not to scream when something crawled across your cheek at midnight. And when you woke up, the bites were already fading. Not healed, but resigned. You dressed, shook out your tunic, watched the swarm rise like smoke, and went about your day. Of course, none of this addressed the true horror waiting just outside the cottage, because in the fields beyond, in the forests, in the hedgerows and ditches, something else stirred at night. Something not entirely animal, something not entirely human. Because while lice burrowed into your skin, there were other things that burrowed into your mind. And they usually arrived after dark. Once the lice settled and the scratching gave way to resigned, half-conscious twitching, there remained one final obstacle between a peasant and actual rest. The dreams. Or more accurately, the night visions, the subconscious visitations, the deep medieval belief that sleep opened a portal to something far more dangerous than fleas or intestinal revolt. Because for the average peasant, dreams were not just dreams. They were warnings, messages, punishments, and sometimes auditions for possession. The medieval world took dreams seriously. They were considered a form of divine communication, a language of symbols decipherable by monks, mystics, and whichever relative had a reputation for seeing things no one else could. Entire manuscripts were devoted to dream interpretation. One of the most widely read was the Somniale Danielis, a dream dictionary that listed over 380 different dream elements and their corresponding meanings. Dreams of fish meant wealth. Dreams of losing teeth meant death. Dreams of urinating on a tree meant prosperity, though how anyone discovered that is unclear. Most peasants could not read these manuals, but the ideas filtered down through oral tradition. Villages had dream whisperers, older women or spiritually twitchy men who claimed to understand the meanings of night visions and could explain what it meant when someone dreamed of a crow with human hands. Some families kept dream journals, though they were usually oral and delivered over breakfast, along with a great deal of squinting and superstition. Nightmares were not simply bad dreams, they were invasions. It was commonly believed that spirits, demons or witches could enter the body during sleep and cause terrifying visions. These night intrusions were often blamed for sudden deaths, seizures, or people waking up and forgetting their own name. The most feared of these visitations was the night hag, a spectral figure believed to sit on a person's chest while they slept, draining their energy or whispering evil thoughts directly into their lungs. Sleep paralysis, though not understood, was frequently cited as evidence of these visitations. A person would awaken in the middle of the night, fully aware but unable to move, often with a crushing weight on their chest and a sense of overwhelming dread. They might see a shadowy figure in the corner, or hear whispers that had no speaker. These events were taken as serious spiritual warnings. The afflicted person might be blessed with holy water, subjected to a minor exorcism, or instructed to sleep with a crucifix under their pillow, preferably one not already gnawed on by mice. Dreams were also political. Monarchs and nobles sometimes claimed that dreams guided their decisions. Saints were said to have been visited in their sleep by angels, who delivered instructions for building churches or predicting plagues. Meanwhile, peasants often dreamed of food. A recurring dream among the starving was the feast, a table of bread, cheese, and roasted meat that would vanish as soon as they tried to eat. This was sometimes interpreted as divine mockery, or a warning not to covet above one's station. Pregnant women were especially monitored for dreams. It was believed that certain dreams could reveal the nature of the unborn child. A dream of a snake meant the baby would be clever. A dream of fire meant a fiery temper. A dream of drowning was universally considered bad and usually meant someone needed to bury something in the yard just in case. These dreams were not laughed off. They were discussed in hushed tones and factored into decisions about birthing practices and baptism schedules. Even animals were believed to dream. If a dog growled in its sleep, it had seen something from the other side. If a chicken clucked violently while dozing, it was warning of misfortune. A dreaming pig, especially one that squealed without waking, was said to be wrestling with a demon. There are no known solutions for this situation, though some households responded by hitting the pig with a broom and reciting the Lord's Prayer backwards. Some peasants attempted to control their dreams. Dream incubation, as it is now known, was practiced in medieval Europe through ritual sleeping techniques. This could involve fasting before bed, sleeping on one's left side, or placing specific herbs under the pillow to encourage prophetic visions. Mugwort, vervain, and henbane were commonly used. They also frequently caused hallucinations, so whether the dreams were supernatural or chemically induced remains up for debate. Not all dreams were ominous. Some were comforting. A dream of flying was thought to mean spiritual elevation. A dream of a spinning wheel indicated prosperity. A dream of dancing might mean a good harvest, or, depending on the dreamer's age, impending madness. It was a thin line. Interpretation was less about science and more about social mood. If your neighbour liked you, your dream was a blessing. If your neighbour hated you, it was a sign of demonic possession. There were also sleepwalking episodes, which were not understood as medical phenomena, but as evidence that the dreamer was being controlled by something else. Sleepwalkers were sometimes restrained at night with cloth ties or placed behind makeshift barriers of chairs and farm tools to prevent them from wandering into the forest, or, worse, into someone else's cottage. If a person repeatedly sleepwalked into the same location, it was believed they were being summoned. To what, no one knew. And then there were the dreamless. People who claimed not to dream or who never remembered them were viewed with suspicion. Dreams were seen as a natural function of the soul, like breathing. To lack them entirely suggested either divine punishment or a spiritual block. Remedies included prayer, fasting, and being slapped by a saint's relic, assuming one was available. If no relic was present, a particularly holy chicken feather was considered a suitable substitute. Even when dreams were forgotten, the residue remained. A bad mood in the morning was attributed to night influences. Unexpected good fortune might be chalked up to a dream someone else had on your behalf. Entire arguments were started over dreams, accusations were made, apologies were demanded for things people had done while unconscious. There was no escape. The brain did not rest. It simply shifted theatres. Eventually the morning returned. The rooster crowed, the children argued about lice, the pot was emptied, and the memory of the dream faded into the back of the mind where it would linger just long enough to cause discomfort. Life resumed, but the residue remained. The knowledge that whatever you dreamed might not have been yours, that maybe something had borrowed your mind for the night and left a few strange footprints behind, which made the act of falling asleep all the more complicated. Because after the lights were out and the scratching began and the lice got comfortable again, there was still the question of what your dreams might bring. Or worse, who else might be watching them? Of course, if anything did come crawling into your subconscious, there was always the hope that your blanket would be thick enough to stop it, assuming you had a blanket. Which naturally brings us to what peasants actually used to keep warm when the chickens weren't enough. Blankets, as modern viewers know them, did not exist for the average medieval peasant. Not in the way we picture them. No crisp white duvets, no thick fleece throws, no neatly folded linens smelling faintly of lavender and machine-washed privilege. In a 14th century cottage, warmth was not a product. It was a negotiation. And what people used to sleep under was often indistinguishable from what they used to haul turnips earlier in the day. Most peasants did not own a dedicated blanket. Instead, they layered whatever fabric they had available. A cloak, a spare tunic, an old piece of sacking used to transport onions. In some cases, families shared one heavy piece of woven wool that was never washed, always damp, and permanently smelled like a wet dog that had recently been emotionally defeated. This communal coverlet was passed from person to person throughout the night as people turned, shifted, or were shoved in pursuit of a warmer spot. Clothing doubled as insulation. Most people slept in the same garments they wore all day. Removing clothing at night was not common. For one, it was cold. For another, modesty and superstition discouraged it. Being caught undressed during a fire, a break-in, or an unexpected plague visitation was considered both shameful and logistically inconvenient. If you died in your sleep, it was expected that your soul be decently dressed for its departure. Death was not to be greeted in a nightshirt, especially when no one owned one. The wealthier classes might sleep in linen shift or woolen robes, but peasants wore what they had. That often meant rough linen underclothes layered under patched tunics, and, if they were lucky, a fraying outer cloak that had previously belonged to someone now deceased or missing. Boots were removed, but socks often stayed on, assuming the socks had not been repurposed as gloves or stuffed into gaps in the wall to stop the wind. There was no concept of fabric softener. Most clothing was scratchy, coarse and stiff. Linen became brittle after too many washings with lye. Wool was rarely treated properly, leading to garments that repelled both water and comfort. If your sleeping layer was not actively stabbing you in the thigh, it was considered high quality. As for bedding itself, the mattress was rarely more than a wooden frame filled with straw, hay or reeds. Sometimes these materials were loosely wrapped in fabric to keep them from escaping into the mouths of sleepers. Other times there was no barrier at all. You simply lay on a bundle of agricultural waste and hoped the insects were already full. In winter, people added animal skins or coarse woven mats. In summer, they removed what they could without exposing themselves to the full horror of the floor. Children often slept on the ground, especially in larger families. A woven mat, a wool tunic, and the vague promise of body heat were their only protection. Babies were swaddled tightly and placed between adults or near the hearth, sometimes in a basket to avoid being crushed. The basket was often the same one used earlier for collecting eggs or carrying firewood. The hearth played a major role in warmth. Even in cottages with no chimney, the central fire offered a small radius of tolerable temperature. Sleeping near it was ideal, but came with risks. Sparks, smoke. sudden waking nightmares involving your feet catching fire. Still, many chose proximity to warmth over safety. Cold was not just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Hypothermia could strike even indoors, especially during harsh winters or in poorly constructed homes. Some households resorted to burning dried animal dung as fuel, which created a smoky heat and a smell that permanently embedded itself into the walls, clothing, and moral fabric of the household. When temperatures dropped below freezing, families became a singular organism of layered humanity. Everyone slept in the same bed or in close proximity, stacked like firewood, and rotated occasionally to keep extremities from going numb. Domestic animals were pulled in: chickens, dogs, goats, and in desperate cases even pigs. It was not cosy, it was tactical. The goal was not sleep, the goal was survival. There were no bedtime routines, no candles by the bedside, no mugs of warm milk. People collapsed into whatever horizontal surface was available, wrapped in whatever fabric had not been stolen by their sibling, or reeking of last week's soup. They slept in bursts, interrupted by noise, temperature shifts, lice, livestock, or the occasional existential dread that came with being alive in the 1300s. Even when blankets were available, they were shared. Personal coverings were rare. The communal nature of peasant life extended to sleep in every uncomfortable way. Your warmth was tied to the people next to you. If someone rolled away or died in the night, everyone felt the temperature drop. The death of a family member sometimes meant more than grief. It meant one less source of heat. There were attempts to innovate. Some families hung cloth or animal hide over sleeping areas to trap warmth. Others dug shallow depressions into the earth floor and filled them with straw to create nest-like sleeping pits. These worked until they became infested or wet. Some cottages had raised sleeping platforms, which stayed warmer than the ground and kept sleepers away from the worst drafts, but most just endured. Winter was a season of low expectations. Lack of warmth affected health. Chronic exposure to cold led to respiratory problems, joint stiffness, and poor circulation. Children developed chilblains, painful swellings on fingers and toes. Adults developed arthritis before the age of 30. It was not uncommon to wake up with frost on one's blanket, if there was a blanket to frost at all. Eventually the fire burned down. The last bits of shared fabric were tugged between shivering bodies. Sleep came in brief segments, wrapped in musty wool and the sound of someone coughing blood into the hearth. And in the dim hours before dawn, when the cold was at its worst and the chickens had not yet stirred, you might question whether warmth was ever real or just a legend told by wealthier villagers. But morning did come. The frost receded. The fire was rebuilt. The cloaks were shaken out and rebuttoned. The bedding was left to ferment another day, and the cycle repeated. Of course, for many peasants, warmth was not the only concern at night, because staying warm meant staying inside, and staying inside meant sharing space, and sharing space meant dealing with sounds that did not belong to anyone, or at least not anyone still alive. Which brings us quite naturally to the topic of haunted cottages, and the many reasons medieval peasants slept with one eye open. There was a reason so many peasants muttered a prayer before bed. Not out of piety, out of survival. Because while hunger, cold, and lice could be scratched, ignored, or endured, the unexplained was something else entirely. Something that crept through the cracks of timber walls and waited until the fire had dimmed and the last words had been spoken. Something that arrived when no one was supposed to be awake. Haunted cottages were not rare in medieval Europe. They were expected. In fact, many homes were assumed to be at least slightly haunted, especially if they had existed for more than one generation. Death was not something that happened elsewhere. It happened in the same room where you cooked, slept, gave birth, argued, and forgot where you put the firewood. People died inside their homes, usually in their beds, surrounded by the very furniture that would be reused for the next 10 years. The floor absorbed it, the walls remembered, and the air never really moved on. These ghosts were not the dramatic chain-rattling wraiths of modern fiction. They were quieter, purer. They lived in creeks that did not match the wind, in cold spots where no air should move, in the soft weight of something that sat on the edge of the bed but never climbed in. Many households had rules. Do not speak aloud after a certain hour. Do not leave both shutters open at night. Do not sweep after sundown. Each of these was designed to keep the unseen in its proper place. The belief in wandering spirits was not fringe theology. It was daily life. Church sermons warned of souls trapped in purgatory, wandering for centuries seeking rest or revenge. Local traditions fed into these beliefs with stories of murdered travellers, betrayed lovers, or cursed children who returned to haunt the hearth that failed them. Many cottages had histories that no one liked to mention. A tragic fire, a lingering illness, a body buried too close to the house because the ground had thawed just enough, and they could not be bothered to walk to the churchyard. These stories weren't just remembered, they were inherited, passed down like recipes or debts. A family might whisper that the southwest corner was cold because that's where grandmother died during the famine, or that the loft was never to be entered after midnight because that's where the dog refused to sleep after seeing something there. Animals, of course, were considered the most reliable ghost detectors. If a cat stared into a corner too long, or a hen refused to roost in its usual spot, it meant something was wrong. Homes were often built with symbolic protection. A common one was the witch bottle, a small container buried under the threshold or hearth filled with hair, fingernails and sometimes urine. This was believed to trap malicious spirits before they could cross the threshold. Others etched apotropaic symbols into beams, scratched onto door frames or carved into stone. These were not decorative, they were functional. Like medieval antivirus software but carved into your ceiling. If someone believed their home was haunted, they might consult a local wise woman or cunning man. These individuals were not always trusted, but were often feared enough to be listened to. A common remedy for a haunted home was the use of loud noises, bells, clanging pots, or deliberate shouting to drive the spirit out. Some burned specific herbs like yarrow or juniper. Others simply left food offerings overnight and hoped the ghost would find it sufficient and move on. When a spirit refused to leave, drastic action was sometimes taken. Objects could be removed and burned. Walls could be repainted with a mixture of lime and sacred water. In rare cases, entire rooms were abandoned. A family might continue living in 3/4 of a cottage while the haunted section remained untouched, its window nailed shut, its floor swept only under daylight, and its door never fully closed in case something needed to exit. Sleep in a haunted cottage was fragile, not because of loud noises or violent shaking, but because of stillness, a breath that stopped, a fire that went out too soon, a cold that seemed to wrap itself only around one side of the bed. Peasants often tied protective charms to their bedposts, a sprig of hawthorn, a coin blessed by a priest, a knotted string thought to bind the wandering dead. Children were taught not to speak of their dreams if they involved a figure wearing black. Women slept with a blade under the mattress. Men pretended not to notice the chill. Some families believed in household spirits that were not evil but mischievous. Known by many names, from brownies in Scotland to domovoi in Eastern Europe, these spirits were thought to help around the house, if respected, or cause minor havoc if angered. Forgetting to leave out a bowl of porridge could result in spilled milk, broken pottery, or livestock that refused to cooperate. These beings were blamed for everything from missing shoes to sour milk. It was easier to blame a ghost than your own clumsiness. The fear of being watched was ever present. In homes with thatched roofs, people often reported hearing footsteps above them, despite there being no loft. In rooms with open rafters, strange objects sometimes appeared overnight, such as bones, feathers, or unfamiliar cloth. These were not cleaned up. They were avoided. Moving them might disturb whatever had left them. Better to sleep around them than risk disrespect. Children were especially sensitive to spirits, or so people believed. If a child cried suddenly in their sleep, it was often blamed on a visitation. Remedies included whispering the child's name backward 3 times, passing a candle over the forehead, or placing a coin under the tongue. None of these worked consistently, but they gave the parents something to do while the floorboards settled and the dog refused to enter the room. Eventually fatigue won. The fire dimmed to its final glow. The last muttered prayer drifted upward, and sleep came, uneven, fragile, interrupted by dreams and the occasional sound that everyone agreed had simply been the wind. It was always the wind. But not every wind came from outside. Because after the ghosts had quieted and the scratching had ceased and the shutters had stopped rattling, there remained one final horror of the peasant night. One so common, so frequent, and so mysteriously powerful, it was feared to be supernatural in origin. The sudden, untraceable, malevolent force known across Europe as the cursed midnight flatulence. And that, unfortunately, must be examined next. Once the ghosts retreated back into the walls and the cold began to thaw with the first warm breath of dawn, the cottage would often be overtaken by one final and entirely human horror. It was invisible, unpredictable, frequently blamed on witches, and known in more than one village as the Devil's Whisper. Medieval flatulence was not simply a joke. It was a curse, a diagnosis, a warning, and occasionally a weapon. The average peasant diet was an explosive arrangement. Grains, legumes, onions, cabbage, and turnips made up the bulk of every meal. Meat was rare, cheese was risky, and the concept of a probiotic did not exist unless you count licking mould off a brick and hoping for the best. Fermented foods, especially black bread left too long on the hearth, only added fuel to the fire. The result was a digestive system under siege, constantly fermenting, rarely regulated and regularly betrayed by a sudden abdominal lurch in the middle of the night. Cabbage was particularly dangerous. It featured heavily in peasant stews and soups, and was often boiled into oblivion to soften the texture. Unfortunately, this did nothing for its reputation as the kingmaker of medieval gas. Onions came next. They were one of the most common and affordable vegetables available, and like cabbage, they possessed a unique talent for inflaming the lower intestine. Beans were an occasional luxury, but no safer. Lentils and peas were more common, dried and rehydrated into pastes that produced side effects still studied by modern historians with open windows. By the time night arrived and the last embers were dying in the hearth, the human body was primed for nocturnal combustion. The sound of sleep was not silence. It was a gentle chorus of grunts, coughs, wheezes, and the occasional burst of what some referred to as midnight thunder. And in a one-room cottage packed with 6 humans, 2 goats, and a dog that never fully relaxed, this presented logistical and spiritual complications. In certain parts of Europe, chronic flatulence was believed to be a sign of demonic interference. This was not metaphor. There were written accounts suggesting that excessive nighttime emissions could be the result of a minor possession or a cursed object hidden inside the cottage. In one French village, it was claimed that a woman's persistent gas was caused by a comb stolen from a nun. In another, a man was accused of harbouring an imp inside his belly who whistled every night between sleep cycles. These claims were rarely questioned, mostly because everyone in the room had smelled it. Medical explanations were just as bizarre. Medieval physicians working with the theory of the 4 humours believed that flatulence was caused by an imbalance of wind in the stomach, known as flatus ventosus. Treatments included drinking warm beer with crushed mint, rubbing the abdomen with oil, or in extreme cases, bleeding the patient behind the ears to release pressure. None of these worked. Some made it worse. What made medieval flatulence truly terrifying was its unpredictability. It could arrive quietly and linger for hours. It could explode suddenly, waking the dog and shaming the offender into fake coughing for cover. It could escape in shifts, subtle bursts that created confusion and internal suspicion among the sleeping. In group settings, especially with strangers or guests, the air could grow so thick with denial that no one spoke until morning. Even then, it was understood that some things were never to be discussed. This shame was not universal. In some rural regions, flatulence was greeted with laughter or even respect, especially if it was particularly musical. There were documented peasant contests involving pitch, duration, and vibrato, often held after harvest festivals when food was plentiful and clothing was loosely belted. One 14th century tavern in Saxony had a carved wooden chair known as the farting throne, where villagers took turns seeing who could produce the loudest blast while reciting a prayer. There was equal parts game, sermon, and spiritual exorcism. But in the quiet of the home, especially during winter when windows remained sealed, the consequences of shared intestinal unrest could become deadly. Not medically, socially. If someone disrupted the sleeping order with an untimely release, they risked losing their spot near the hearth or being reassigned to the damp side of the bed. Children were rarely blamed. Elders were granted a certain leniency. Everyone else knew the rules. The smell was worsened by diet and amplified by proximity. Peasants slept close together, their faces sometimes inches apart. Blankets were communal, breathing was collective, and when one sleeper committed a chemical offence, the fallout was immediate. Someone groaned, someone shifted, someone coughed dramatically. The dog sat up, the goat farted in sympathy, and the perpetrator stared at the ceiling pretending to pray. There were attempts to mask the stench. Herbs were scattered near sleeping areas. Dried lavender, thyme and sage were popular, though most peasants could not afford to waste edible plants on air purification. Sacks of dried flowers were tied to rafters, but these rarely overpowered the raw fermentation of a stomach full of cabbage and regret. In desperation, some households burned animal dung at night. The theory was that the smell of burning waste would cancel out other smells. It did not. Despite all this, flatulence held a strange symbolic power. In some parts of England, it was believed that farting on a newborn baby could grant it protection from evil spirits. In northern Italy, newly married couples were encouraged to pass gas in front of each other within the first week to break curses related to infertility. There is no evidence this worked, but it did establish a tone for the marriage. Even saints were not immune. Several hagiographies mention holy men who suffered from digestive problems so severe that they were considered tests from God. One monk reportedly fasted for 3 days and still emitted such a powerful nocturnal blast that the abbot ordered him to sleep in the stable. The monk later claimed to have received a vision while surrounded by goats. Whether this was divine or methane-induced remains a topic of quiet debate. Eventually the night moved on. The wind inside and outside the cottage settled. The fire collapsed into ashes, and the room returned to its usual bouquet of straw, sweat, wet wool, and faintly cursed cabbage. Sleep resumed, or at least the shallow, half-conscious daze that passed for sleep in a world without insulation, plumbing, or dignity. And when the rooster crowed too early and the goat began chewing on someone's sock, and the children woke up screaming about worms again, no one mentioned what had happened during the night. Not out loud. It was understood. But not everything passed as quietly. Because beyond the cottage walls, beyond the lumpy mattress and sour air, something else stirred in the darkness. Something not born from the stomach, but from stories, from warnings, from traditions older than the church and stranger than the stars. Because when peasants finally stepped outside for morning chores, they often avoided one place above all others, the well. If a peasant woke up before sunrise and had the misfortune of stepping outside into the misty chill, there was one place they instinctively avoided unless absolutely necessary. Not the forest, not the latrine pit, not even the chicken coop where something had definitely been moving without feathers last week. It was the well, quiet, still, cold to the touch, and according to most village grandmothers, cursed 6 days out of 7 and deeply suspicious on the 7th. The medieval well was the source of life and sickness at once. It gave water for cooking, cleaning and drinking. It also gave cholera, dysentery, and a long slow death that began with stomach cramps and ended in a very unpleasant funeral. Most peasants had no idea what bacteria were. They did not know that feces seeped into groundwater, or that storing rotting meat near a water source was a bad idea. They only knew that sometimes the water made you sick, and sometimes it made your whole family sick, and sometimes it made your cow miscarry. And when that happened, the well became suspect. This suspicion took on mythic proportions. It was widely believed that wells could be cursed. A cursed well might run dry in a rainstorm or overflow during a drought. Its water might taste sweet but carry disease. A healthy person might drink from it one day and be buried 2 days later with blackened lips and a stomach that sounded like thunder in a wooden bucket. The explanations varied. Some said spirits lived in the well. Others believed witches cast spells by tossing objects into the depths. Coins, teeth, eggs, dolls, ribbons, bones. Everything had been found down there at some point, and none of it belonged. Nighttime made the well worse. No one wanted to draw water after dark. It was too quiet, too still, and more than a few people claimed to hear voices echoing up from below. Some said the voices called their names. Others said they warned of things that hadn't happened yet. A few claimed to have seen something move under the surface, even when the moonlight hit the water just right, and there was clearly nothing there, just ripples, and a single black feather that hadn't come from any known bird. Drawing water was a ritual. The rope was checked. The bucket was blessed with a cross made in the air. Some households insisted on turning in a full circle before lifting the handle. Others muttered short rhymes or dropped a pinch of salt in first to wake the water. You never insulted the well. You never spoke about it while standing next to it, and under no circumstances did you look directly into it during a full moon. Water contamination was rampant. Wells were often located near cesspits, livestock pens, or burial grounds. Runoff carried all sorts of joyful substances into the ground. Dead animals fell in and stayed there. Dead people too, occasionally. In some places, wells became so foul that the water changed colour or gave off a smell strong enough to make soup curdle. Yet people still drank from them, because there were no alternatives. Rivers were worse. Rainwater was unpredictable, and boiled water was considered suspiciously bland. Sometimes wells became battlegrounds. Villagers accused each other of poisoning the water. A sick child might trigger a chain of suspicion that ended in someone being tied to a chair and interrogated about what they had tossed into the well last week. Suspicion frequently fell on midwives, herbalists, and anyone with a mole in the wrong place. Trials were rare, but fear was common. In one notable case in Bohemia, an entire hamlet stopped using their well for a year after someone saw a toad with an extra leg crawl out of the bucket and explode. The toad was never found. Protective charms were used liberally. Some wells had carved stones placed at their base during construction. Others were ringed with hawthorn or nettles to ward off spirits. In parts of Ireland and Wales, holy wells were maintained with flowers and candles and guarded fiercely by the community. People believed that disrespecting a well could bring ruin to an entire village. Crops would fail, milk would sour, marriages would turn bitter, and the sheep would start walking in circles again, while dreams were also feared. If someone dreamed of falling into a well, it meant death. If they dreamed of drawing up blood instead of water, it meant betrayal. If they dreamed of a dry well, it meant they were barren or about to be. Some people refused to sleep near the side of the house that faced the well, believing that the dreams could crawl through the walls if they lined up too close. Water carriers had their own rituals. Most villages had designated individuals who fetched water each morning. These people were respected, envied, and slightly feared. They often knew which houses were cursed based on how the water behaved inside them. Some claimed the water turned cloudy before a death. Others noticed a strange ringing in the ears while carrying a particularly bad bucket. None of these stories were written down. They were whispered between yawns and sloshing footsteps. Even the tools were suspect. Ropes rotted, handles splintered, buckets cracked. A broken bucket rope was considered a bad omen. A bucket that came back empty more than once in a row might be burned and buried. People did not throw these things away lightly. They understood that the well remembered who disrespected it. A woman who insulted her bucket was rumoured to have lost all her teeth in her sleep 3 days later. Her bucket was found full the next morning. No one used it again. Eventually the sun rose and the fears of night slipped away. The water was drawn, the soup was made, the goats were watered and the children drank their fill. No one spoke about the shadow they saw in the corner of the well, or the strange whisper they heard when the bucket passed the halfway point. It was morning now. The well was fine. Everything was fine. But some mornings, there were frogs. Frogs were not inherently evil. But when a frog appeared in the well after a dream of teeth falling out, and someone in the village had just died from a stomach cramp no one could explain, people took notice. The frogs were watched, sometimes captured and relocated, occasionally salted, burned, or interrogated, and if the frog croaked twice before hopping away, you stayed indoors for the rest of the day. Because the well was not just a hole in the ground, it was a presence. It was a boundary between what was above and what was not meant to come back. And if your reflection ever blinked before you did not speak of it. You simply closed the shutters, salted the doorway, and pretended you had not gone for water at all. And yet, for all the fear and folklore, thirst was stronger than superstition. People kept returning, morning after morning. They knew the risk, they knew the stories, but the soup would not boil itself. Of course, none of this compares to what happened when you had to sleep beside someone who had just bathed in that same cursed water for the first time in 3 months, because there is something far worse than foul air or haunted buckets. It is the smell of medieval cleanliness, and you're about to find out exactly how bad that could get. There were certain smells medieval peasants expected to encounter in a one-room cottage. Mouldy straw, roasted onion, wet dog, the lingering consequences of boiled cabbage and regret. But there was one smell that caused more tension than all the others combined. One that filled the room with unease and forced everyone to pause and squint in the dark like they were staring at a very dangerous miracle. It was the smell of soap. Bathing, in theory, was not discouraged in medieval Europe. In fact, in the early Middle Ages, cleanliness was still tied to religious virtue. Monasteries maintained bathhouses. Priests washed their feet as part of ritual humility. Even the church offered guidance on when to scrub your body and why. But by the time peasants were cramming into half-frozen cottages with leaking roofs and 3-day-old porridge on their tunics, bathing had become less of a moral obligation and more of an annual suggestion. Soap was not cheap. Lye had to be made from wood ash and urine. Animal fat had to be boiled. Herbs had to be gathered, dried, and added in proportions only the village elder's grandmother seemed to remember correctly. The result was a gritty paste or hardened brick that smelled faintly of old bacon and regret. Store-bought soap, for those who could access market towns, was imported and expensive. Made with fine oils and delicate fragrances, it was mostly reserved for the wealthy or those who had something to prove. Bathing indoors was a logistical nightmare. The average cottage had no tub, no privacy, no heating other than the central hearth that also cooked dinner and dried socks. A person wanting to bathe had to either crouch in a wooden barrel half filled with lukewarm water, or sponge themselves off with a damp rag in the corner, while pretending not to hear their uncle snoring directly behind them. It was not refreshing. It was damp performance art. Water had to be fetched from the well, boiled, poured carefully into a bucket or basin. By the time enough water was ready for even a partial soak, most peasants had already given up and returned to more familiar activities like mending their boots or screaming about lice. Those who did go through with it often came away pink, shivering, and mildly injured. Scalded feet were common, slipping on wet rushes even more so. One known remedy for a twisted ankle caused by falling out of a bath was to never bathe again. There were also spiritual concerns. Some believed that warm water opened the pores too much and allowed evil spirits to enter the body. Others claimed that washing away too much dirt at once could lead to fevers, bad luck, or divine retribution for vanity. A man who emerged too clean from a bath might be accused of sorcery. A woman who smelled like herbs instead of cabbage might be asked who she was trying to seduce and whether she had recently danced barefoot in the woods. In urban centres, public bathhouses existed, but their reputation was complicated. They were places of cleanliness and conversation, but also gossip, sin and diseases, with names whispered but never written down. Cities like Paris, London and Prague had thriving bathhouse cultures at various points, but as plagues swept through Europe, Trust in shared tubs eroded. Some bathhouses were shuttered. Others were repurposed for less sanitary activities. One chronicler in 1382 noted that his local bathhouse now served as a bakery by day and a site of unspeakable moral decay by night. He did not specify whether the bread was good. For peasants, the bathhouse was often too far away, too expensive, or too dangerous to visit regularly. Instead, they relied on dry cleaning methods, not the modern kind. More the kind that involves scraping the skin with a knife or rubbing oneself with sand and then brushing it off with straw. This exfoliation sometimes removed actual dirt and sometimes just the top layer of skin. The result was rarely worth the effort. Feet were the exception. Since they were frequently soaked by mud, urine, and suspicious puddles, they received occasional attention. But even then, the goal was not cleanliness. It was damage control. Soaking in cold water to reduce swelling, rubbing pig fat on cracked heels, hanging them over the fire in winter to see if they still had feeling. One peasant diary described his feet as his most honest feature. They always told the truth about how hard life was. Hair was another matter entirely. Peasants rarely cut their hair short unless lice became unbearable or someone lost a wager. Long hair trapped warmth, but also dirt, insects, and the occasional twig that no one remembered stepping on. Washing hair required soap, water, and someone with strong fingers willing to dig through layers of grease and guilt. Most people opted for braiding or covering their heads instead. Scarves, caps, and hats were not just fashion. They were containment. When someone did decide to wash thoroughly, the consequences echoed through the household. The smell of soap cut through the room like incense at a funeral. Heads turned. Questions were asked. Were they trying to impress someone? Had they received bad news? Was a relative visiting from town? Children often cried. Dogs became confused. Chickens refused to make eye contact. And if the bather looked too refreshed, they were often asked to leave the cottage for a while and let the smell settle. Cleanliness had social weight. A person who was too clean might be considered untrustworthy, not poor enough, not tired enough, not suffering properly. In some villages, it was more respectable to stink, to carry the weight of work in every pore, to have fingernails permanently stained by soil and cheeks that glowed not with soap but with windburn and goat spit. Smelling like rosemary was suspicious, smelling like soup was safe. Still, there were moments when someone bathed just to feel something different, after a birth, before a burial, at the end of a long harvest. These moments were not private, they were events, talked about for weeks, measured against past washings, compared like battles. The year Hilda washed twice was remembered like a flood or a bad winter. The boy who bathed in the creek every Thursday was either holy or insane, possibly both. Eventually the clean person faded back into the collective scent. The soap wore off. The warmth vanished. The water, which had been reused for laundry, feet, or boiling questionable roots, was finally tossed out the door. Life resumed. The cottage air returned to its standard blend of breath, firewood, wool, and apology. And as the evening settled in and everyone returned to their bedrolls and mats, the clean one lay down among the rest, smelling faintly of effort and misplaced optimism. Within minutes, the lice returned. The sweat returned. The dog coughed in their face, and just like that, they were home again. Of course, if that cleanliness had come too late, if someone in the household had already caught something contagious from a cousin who coughed wrong, then the bathing would do nothing. Because no matter how clean you were, if one person brought the plague into the house, the rest of the night was no longer about sleep. It was about who would wake up. It did not take much to turn a restless night into something else entirely. One cough, one shiver, one sharp inhale from the person next to you, followed by silence that went on just long enough to be noticed. That was all it took. The straw shifted. The fire crackled. And suddenly everyone in the cottage was awake, listening, not moving, hoping the sound did not repeat. Because if it did, It meant the worst thing possible in a house with one room, one bucket, and no spare bed. It meant someone was sick. Illness in the Middle Ages was not something that arrived with ceremony. It slipped in through the thatch. It clung to the hem of a visitor's cloak. It was passed in a handshake or a shared cup, or a particularly passionate sneeze from across the market square. There was no understanding of germs, only patterns. One person coughed. Another person died. A third person started twitching, and the pattern began again. When someone got sick at night, there was nowhere to go. No second room. No bed to isolate in. You were sick right there, on the same lumpy mattress you shared with two siblings, a goat, and whatever was nesting in the corner that had started blinking recently. You stayed where you were, sweating, groaning, reeking, and the rest of the family did their best to sleep facing away from you, while wondering quietly whether they should move the chickens to the far end of the cottage just in case. The most common illness was not one thing, but a rotating selection of medieval favourites. Fevers, rashes, coughs that started with a tickle and ended in a full-body spasm, vomiting that refused to be discreet, diarrhea that required the chamber pot be emptied 5 times before sunrise. People did not whisper the names of their sicknesses, they whispered what had happened to others. Remember when Thomas started coughing like that? Remember when Agnes said she had a chill in her teeth? Remember when that child down the road turned purple and stopped blinking? There were attempts at treatment. Onion poultices pressed to the chest, boiled leeks shoved up the nose, garlic tied to the ankles. If the patient was conscious enough, they might be given warm beer, cabbage broth, or a strange combination of herbs that included things found in the floor rushes, and sometimes something that may have once been a beetle. If they were not conscious, people simply rubbed things on their feet and prayed louder. Doctors were not involved. Most peasants never saw one. Medical care came from whoever in the village had the oldest hands or the strongest opinions. Remedies included bleeding, sweating, vomiting on purpose, or placing a live toad under the bed to draw out the evil. If none of that worked, someone would be sent to fetch the priest. That was not a good sign. At night the cottage changed. Whispers turned to instructions. Children were pushed toward the coldest side of the room. The dog was chased away. The fire was stoked with wet wood just to make it smoke more. People stayed up pretending to sleep, counting coughs. If the sick person stopped making noise altogether, someone would nudge them to make sure they had not died already. And if they had, it became a different sort of night entirely. Death at night was a logistical challenge. The body could not be moved until morning. The ground was too hard. The priest would not come until the sun was up, so the corpse stayed where it was, in the same bed, wrapped in the same blanket, often mistaken for still sleeping. Children were told not to touch. Chickens were chased away. The dog, who always knew first, would not come near. The air grew heavy. The fire burned lower. And someone always cried into the straw, quietly enough not to wake the others who were already pretending not to be awake. Contagion was not understood, but it was feared. If one person died of a cough, others often followed. Some families burned the bedding, others refused to sleep near the same spot. Straw was scraped out with sticks. Doors were left open to let the bad air out, even in freezing weather. A fresh sprig of rosemary was hung from the rafters if anyone could afford it. If not, nettles were used. If even that was too expensive, someone just muttered a prayer and spit on the wall for good luck. The sounds of sickness were familiar. Wet coughing, rattling breaths, sudden gasps. The worst was silence. Silence meant a change, either better or final. If the sick person began to speak clearly, it was sometimes taken as a sign they were about to die. The clarity of death, they called it. A final burst of lucidity before the end. Some made confessions, some asked for water, some said nothing, and simply blinked twice before going still. Wakes were short. The body was washed in cold water if time allowed. Otherwise they were wrapped in whatever was cleanest and laid near the door until morning. No one slept. Not really. People dozed upright, eyes open, listening for the next cough, or the return of one that had stopped too suddenly, and always wondering beneath it all who might be next. Plague was the word no one said unless they had to. When it came fast. Symptoms could appear at sunset and end in death before dawn. Swollen lumps under the arms, black spots on the skin, bleeding from the nose or mouth. Those who survived the first night often survived altogether. Those who did not were buried quickly, sometimes too quickly. There were rumours of people buried alive, of bodies moving in the pit, of coughing under the dirt. No one checked. No one wanted to be next. Not every sickness killed, but every sickness scared. Because one cough could be the beginning of death, of loss, of stories no one wanted to tell again. And so sleep became a negotiation with the body, with the air, with the person 2 feet away who sounded fine an hour ago and now could not breathe without wheezing. Eventually the fire faded. The dog returned. The children stirred. Morning arrived with pale light and the stink of fear. If the sick person had survived the night, they were greeted with cautious relief. If they had not, the routine began again. Straw was burned, bread was blessed, and everyone tried to sleep again the next night as if it would be normal. But everyone remembered, even if they never said it. They remembered who coughed first, and who had slept the closest. Of course, even sickness had its limits. Eventually the body either gave out or got up, and when it did get up, it had to return to work, to cold, to hunger, to the ongoing symphony of nighttime madness that never quite stopped. And if you thought sickness made sleep impossible, wait until you spent the night beside someone who snored loud enough to summon saints. Snoring in the medieval world was not just annoying, it was catastrophic. In a one-room cottage where sleep already bordered on an active imagination, one person's nasal symphony could unravel the sanity of an entire household before the moon had even reached its highest point. There was no escape, no second room, no guest chamber, no hallway to storm down in a huff. There was only the wooden wall, the straw mattress, the suffocating stench of goats, and the relentless sound of what could only be described as a dying ox attempting to whistle through a reed pipe lodged sideways in its skull. People snored, loudly, with vigour, with rhythm, with sudden violent bursts that made dogs leap up and chickens flap themselves sideways into a different dimension. Sleep was communal, and so was the rage. And yet snoring was not always treated as a joke. In many medieval communities it was seen as a medical condition, a spiritual concern, or in rare cases, outright evidence of possession. Because what else could explain that ungodly gurgling when a man who looked entirely normal by daylight lay down and began vibrating the walls with each breath? Medieval physicians, working with the theory of the four humours, believed that snoring was caused by an imbalance of phlegm. If a person had too much cold, wet humour in their body, it would settle in the chest and throat during sleep and cause air to rattle instead of flow. The remedy? Avoid dairy, wrap onions around the neck, or bleed the patient behind the ears. If that failed, they were advised to sleep sitting up, which helped exactly no one, and often led to the sleeper slowly collapsing like a sack of potatoes beside the fire while still snoring vertically. There were also spiritual explanations. Some believed that demons sat on the chest of a sleeping person and caused the air to grind as it passed through the throat. This theory overlapped with night terrors and sleep paralysis, where the sufferer might wake up gasping for breath while the rest of the household screamed about the noise coming from their nose. In especially pious households, a chronic snorer might be sprinkled with holy water in their sleep, which often resulted in a very wet, very confused man swatting at invisible bees, while everyone pretended they had no idea what happened. Sleeping positions were discussed with great seriousness. A person who snored on their back was told to roll to the side. A person who snored on their side was told to roll to the floor. If that did not work, they were kicked until they shifted, which usually brought 10 seconds of silence followed by a deep inhale and a sudden thunderous return that made everyone question their commitment to community living. Some families resorted to placing wooden boards between sleepers, not for privacy, for muffling. The noise itself varied. Some snorers maintained a steady drone like a distant bagpipe being played through a sack of damp wool. Others performed intermittent grunts, snorts, and wheezing build-ups that climaxed with a choked honk and a mouthful of drool. Children often cried, dogs howled, adults developed silent coping mechanisms involving deep breathing, clenched fists, and occasional internal monologues about whether murder for the greater good of sleep counted as a sin. Public shaming was common. A chronic snorer would be the subject of morning jokes, passive-aggressive yawns, or in extreme cases stories retold at market involving metaphors that escalated quickly from pigs to possessed mill wheels. But there was also a quiet reverence. Snorers were often hard workers, well-fed, and deeply unconscious. Their ability to sleep so deeply was both infuriating and slightly admirable. People envied it while plotting to end it. There were tools. Herbal sachets hung near the bed. Wax dripped onto a wooden charm shaped like a nose. In rare cases, a person might wear a stiff collar at night to keep their head tilted upright. None of it worked, and so people adapted. Children learned to fall asleep during the quiet parts. Adults developed the ability to sleep through anything short of structural collapse. And the dog, who had once barked in protest, now just buried its face in its own tail and hoped for morning. Snoring was also seasonal. In winter, with more layers and tighter sleeping arrangements, the snoring grew louder. Warmth made the airways relax, and the sound of 20 people crammed into one space, all gently decaying and dreaming of soup, was broken only by one farmer gasping like a boiling kettle, and his cousin beside him replying with a deep, wet snort that sounded like a cow trying to speak Latin. Spring brought a brief reprieve, though pollen often added a new element. Sneezing, snoring, sneezing again, a rhythm section no one asked for. And then there were the mixed sleepers, families where more than one person snored, but on opposite rhythms. One exhaled while the other inhaled, a duet of doom. When this happened, neighbours sometimes noticed. One documented case from 1477 involves a family being accused of harbouring wolves due to the unholy noises coming from their cottage at night. They had to explain, through coughs and yawns, that it was just their uncle and his strange ability to mimic thunder when digesting cheese. Still, there was etiquette. You did not mention the snoring if the person had brought in firewood that day. You did not accuse someone of ruining your sleep if they were the one who had patched your boots last week. And you absolutely did not blame the oldest person in the room, even if their nose had become a wind instrument capable of producing tones not yet known to science. Respect was maintained. Sort of. Eventually snoring became part of the background. A signal. A landmark. If you heard the third snore, you knew it was nearly midnight. If the big snore had not yet happened, you knew you still had time to sneak out to the chamber pot without getting caught in someone's line of flatulence. It became a sort of peasant sonar, one that told you where you were in the night, and when morning came, the snorer always looked the most refreshed. They stretched, they smiled, they scratched their head and asked why everyone looked so tired. No one answered. The fire was lit, the chickens were fed, and everyone prepared to repeat the ritual again, silently hoping that tonight, maybe just once, that particular nose would take a holiday. Of course, snoring was just one of many human noises that plagued medieval sleep. If you want real chaos, you need to talk about sleep talking. Because once people started muttering in Latin during their dreams and saying things they should not know about the baker's wife, things escalated very quickly. At some point in the dark, half-frozen sprawl of a medieval night, just as your body begins to surrender to the straw, the bells begin again. Not faintly, not politely, but with the sudden, absolute force of a divine cattle prod slamming into your eardrum. There is no snooze button, there is no confusion, there is only the bell, and the terrifying realization that it is 3 a.m, and your local priest has decided that now is the right time to remind everyone that mortality is still very much a thing. Medieval bells were not decorative. They were declarations of power, holiness, and schedule. They tolled for the canonical hours, for deaths, for fires, for festivals, and for reasons no one entirely understood but everyone feared. If you heard a bell in the night, you did not ask questions. You sat upright, disoriented, tried not to wet yourself, and braced for anything from spiritual enlightenment to plague evacuation. Churches were the epicenters of this audio tyranny. They rang bells at matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. In theory, this created a divine rhythm. In practice, it meant no one slept more than 90 minutes without being reminded of sin. Monks adapted, peasants endured, livestock ignored it entirely unless the bell sounded unusually frantic, in which case goats would bleat in unison, and the chickens would briefly reconsider their commitment to life. There were categories of bells. The Sanctus bell was small and designed to call attention during Mass, especially to those nodding off in the back. The passing bell rang when someone was dying. The death knell came after. And if you were truly unlucky, all three happened in one day, ensuring that every meal and bowel movement was soundtracked by the deep, existential echo of someone else's misfortune. Villages with wealthy patrons had massive bells cast from bronze. These were hung in towers and required teams of men to swing. Smaller parishes used handbells, which could be wielded more frequently and tragically more spontaneously. A priest with a point to make might wander the streets at dawn, ringing his handbell and shouting about confession, while bleary-eyed villagers considered converting to any faith that involved silence and sleep. The manufacturing of bells was a process soaked in superstition. Bell founders often performed elaborate rituals before casting. Some included herbs, relics, or holy water mixed into the molten metal. It was believed that bells could repel storms, scare away demons, and ward off disease. Naturally, this led to widespread ringing during times of crisis. Unfortunately, it also meant that your best hope for restful sleep during a thunderstorm was to live very far from anyone with a functioning bell. There were social protocols about who could ring which bell and when. Unauthorized ringing was punishable. In one case from 1359, a drunk gravedigger rang the church bell to celebrate a pig escaping its pen. He was fined, whipped, and banned from bell towers, not because of the act itself, but because he rang the bell out of rhythm, in a tone reserved for funerals. Misusing a bell was considered both rude and borderline heretical. It was the auditory equivalent of announcing the apocalypse and then serving soup. There was also the issue of false alarms. Bells were rung for fires. Fires were common, but so was smoke from cooking, steam from laundry, and the occasional aggressive torch. People became desensitized. A bell at night might mean the tavern had burned down, or that someone's stew boiled over again, or that the bell ringer had sneezed violently and yanked the rope by accident. Either way, you still had to get up and look, because if it was real this time and you stayed in bed, you might wake up dead or French. Speaking of the French, invading armies had their own bells. Marching soldiers brought mobile chimes and signal gongs to coordinate movement. During battle, bells marked shifts in formation and morale. After a battle, victory was announced by church bells looted, repurposed, or rung furiously by surviving priests who had spent the entire skirmish hiding under their cassocks and praying for divine reinforcements. Peasants listening from afar could often tell the outcome of a battle by the tone of the bells. Triumphant bells were loud and wild. Mourning bells were slow and spaced out. And if there were no bells, well, the silence told its own story. Bells were also used in trials. Some judicial duels began with a bell toll. Some confessions were signalled by a ring. In rare cases, a bell was strapped to a criminal as punishment, forcing them to announce their presence as they wandered the village. The message was clear: shame has a sound. And it was probably the last thing you heard before diving into the nearest bush out of sheer embarrassment. The psychological toll of bells was immense. Children grew up associating certain rings with fear. Adults developed twitch responses to particular tones. Couples argued over whether a bell meant one thing or another, only to discover it was just the bell ringer testing the mechanism. because a bird had nested in the housing again. Some villages rotated bell ringers just to avoid one man developing a god complex and ringing every time he stubbed his toe or lost a game of dice. And yet, bells were sacred. They were baptized, named, treated like living creatures. Some were believed to cry when melted down. Others were thought to resist recasting, shattering moulds, or singing out mid-forging with ghostly howls. Superstition surrounded them. Never walk under a silent bell. Never speak ill of the bell in the bell tower. And never, under any circumstance, ring a bell during childbirth, unless you want your newborn to scream in rhythm with it for the rest of its life. Of course, the sleep disruptions were worst in winter. The air was sharper, sound travelled farther, and with windows sealed against the cold, bells became internal earthquakes. The clang vibrated through stone, through bone, through the dreams of a man who had finally fallen asleep after wrestling his neighbour's sheep out of the bed. But no one complained, not openly. You did not argue with God's alarm clock, so you lived with the bells. You timed your chores around them. You learned to sleep between them. You guessed the hour by the groans of the bell tower rope and the way the chickens flinched in their dreams. And when you finally heard the soft clank that marked Compline, the last bell before true rest, you knew you had at least 6 hours before the next sacred catastrophe. But sometimes, in the deep middle of the night, there were other sounds. Stranger sounds. Not bells, but whispers. Echoes of voices in the dark. Breaths that didn't match anyone's body. And footsteps that didn't seem to belong to the living. And if you really want to understand why medieval peasants slept so lightly, we might have to talk about the ghosts. Before you drift off into dreams of turnip taxes and questionable hygiene, go ahead and give this video a like if it made you laugh, learn, or at least grimace politely. Drop a comment letting me know which bizarre bit of history you want to suffer through next. I read every single one while avoiding my own responsibilities. And if you're still awake by some miracle, feel free to check out one of my other videos. Your ancestors fought chickens for blanket rights, so you could enjoy algorithm-approved historical nonsense in peace. Now close your eyes, take a deep breath, and gently drift off. Preferably not next to a goat. Good night.